Hello everyone, you're listening to the Fantasy Football Uptick. I'm Jeremiah Blue, and today we're going to be continuing our RB conversation with standard running backs 5 through 10. If you were listening to our show last week, we started with Zeke, Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, and Alvin Kamara. If you want to hear more about those guys, go look at our last week's show. Before we get into the running backs 5 through 10, I do need to talk about Ezekiel Elliott and Melvin Gordon's holdout, being that this is a running back show. Ezekiel Elliott was number 1 on my list when we did our last podcast. That being said, since then, he's still been holding out. If I had to do a draft today, he would probably end up being number 4 on my list. And the big reason for that is I still think he ends up playing week 1. So with those other guys, I would probably move them up just because there is a risk that he misses games. And if he misses games, I'd rather have the other 3. That being said, with Zeke, unlike Melvin Gordon, I don't think if he doesn't get a contract that he will end up missing any time. We talked about it in last week's show about the August 6th deadline for him to acquire a year on his contract or on his service so that he can eventually become a free agent and make that big money. Whereas Melvin Gordon on the other end, he's on his last year of his contract, so he's more likely to hold out because he's only 1 year away from free agency or receiving that dreaded franchise tag that a lot of those running backs have. So with Melvin Gordon, he's usually my number 5. He won't be in this episode today because I do think that if he doesn't get a contract worked out, his holdout will last into the season, and that's going to move him down to around running back 20, which is lower than most people, but when you really think about it, the seasons are so long that losing some of those games early in the year can really affect you because you won't end up making the playoffs. You lose 3 of your first 4 games because Melvin Gordon's not there, and all of a sudden you're not a playoff team and you start to fall off. Now you're scrambling towards the end of the year, where some of these other guys, the drop-off from Melvin Gordon to, say, Mark Ingram, who's my 19th running back, to me isn't really that big. This is one of the deeper years for tier 2, 3, 4 running backs. Usually there's a pretty big drop-off, and I do think there's a drop-off from 4 to the rest, but once you get to 5 down to about 19, 20, I think that all those guys are relatively close enough that it becomes hard to draft a guy like Gordon who you already know is going to miss time or you feel like is going to miss time when draft day comes around, when these guys are just as close. So for me, Melvin Gordon would almost be taken off my draft board because there's no way he gets to running back 19, not pick 19, running back 19, running back 20 in that range. So Melvin Gordon, again, is off my board until he comes back to the Chargers and he's playing. Now, if he comes back early enough to where he's going to be the starter all year long, for me, he's my number 5 running back. But with that, let's jump into our running backs. The first on the list is Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook's not a guy that I really wanted to like. I own Dalvin Cook in literally 0 of my dynasty leagues. He's kind of an injury risk, but when I really delved into the Minnesota Vikings, I just liked him more and more. First of all, Kirk Cousins is in year 2 of that major contract. He's going to have a little bit better rapport with all his receivers, his tight ends, and his offensive line. So I just assume there's going to be an improvement from an offensive standpoint overall with that alone. Then I look at some of the additions that they made to the offensive line. First of all, they drafted a center in the first round. What that really is going to do for the Minnesota Vikings is now that their center from last year, whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce, is moving over to left guard, and then they signed Klein to battle for the right guard position from free agency, and then they drafted somebody else to battle with Klein for that right guard position. So the interior of their offensive line, I just assume, is going to be much improved. They get the same tackles from last year. Reef wasn't actually a bad tackle at the left side, so he was the best offensive lineman on the field last year for the Minnesota Vikings. And then on the other side, you have O'Neal, who is entering his sophomore season, so he was a rookie last season, so I assume that there's going to be some improvement there. So from an offensive line standpoint, I just expect that they're going to be better. And then when you look at Dalvin Cook, the reason people do not like him is because he gets hurt all the time. My little brother, who happens to be a Minnesota Vikings fan, hates Dalvin Cook because he calls him the Glass Man. If Dalvin Cook was a superhero, he would be the Glass Man, the character played by Samuel L. Jackson. The thing with that is that when I'm looking at injuries, I really don't want to adjust my draft board too much due to injuries, especially when they're coming into training camp healthy, because with running backs, anybody can get hurt at any time. Obviously, guys like Todd Gurley, who we'll get to that here in a little bit, but he's got the arthritis, and that's a little bit scarier because now you're expecting them to at some point that to pop up. But with Dalvin Cook, he's completely healthy. If he goes 16 games, he's going to be an elite running back. If he doesn't, well then what can I say? The other thing with that is, with a lot of these guys, I kind of like to have an opportunity to go out and get their handcuffs. Some of these handcuffs go really high, but Alexander Mattison, I haven't been seeing him going too high in these drafts. You can get him for almost the last pick of the draft, and then you've handcuffed Dalvin Cook, especially in some of these bigger leagues. You can go get Alexander Mattison before everybody else does. You got Dalvin Cook, and now you have the Vikings running game locked up, and I'm already telling you, this offense is going to be much underrated. When people are talking about high-powered offense, the Vikings don't come up very often, but we're talking Diggs, we're talking Thielen, and Kirk Cousins is actually a pretty good quarterback. So I think that overall, they underachieved last year. I think they overachieve a little bit this year comparatively to last year. Dalvin Cook's involved in the passing game. And the other thing to look at is the snap percentage. Everybody's going to talk about, well, he shared the load with Latavius Murray. But if you really look at it, not with Latavius Murray. Latavius Murray is a very capable backup running back. Not dogging on Mattison. He might be just fine, but he's a rookie. Murray was a veteran, and he wasn't seeing the field very often when Dalvin Cook was healthy. So when I go back and look at the film, Dalvin Cook was really only healthy week 1. Week 2, he that's where he became hurt. And then he was kind of banged up all the way until week 9. Week 10, they had their bye. And then week 11, he started to take over as the lead back again. So really, that was week 1, week 11 through 17, so a total of 8 games. In those 8 games, Dalvin Cook had 75% of the snap count during 6 of those games. So 6 out of 8 games, that's with Latavius Murray there, he had 75% of the snap count or more. So I think with Mattison this year and no real depth there, I think Dalvin Cook, assuming he stays healthy, is going to be on the field a lot, and he could really elevate himself. I just feel like the floor with Dalvin Cook, assuming he plays 16 games, which what I would assume with all these guys, with the exception of Gurley, which is the only reason he's a little bit lower on my draft board, because if Gurley plays 16 games, then we're way under drafting him as just a fantasy football community, because he's going pretty far in the ADP. If he plays 16 games, even if it's at 15 snaps a game, he's just going too low. But with Dalvin Cook, assuming he plays 16 games, and again, he is healthy right now, I would say that the floor on him it's a top 10 running back. There's just no way he falls out of that based off of how good the Vikings offense should be, and then the fact that he's going to be just a lead back. So if you look back at David Johnson last year when he got that workload, even on a bad team, he finished in the top 11, at least in my draft, or at least in my league based on our scoring setting, which is a standard setting. And David Johnson's actually better at receiving than he is at actually running the ball like a running back. But I think Dalvin Cook is a sure bet you're getting a top 10 running back, and he's the 5th running back off the board. All right, the next guy on the list I really love, and his name is Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon last year was 3rd in yards per game. He played 14 games, and without Andy Dalton for a lot of those games, and now he's getting a new head coach. I think he's very similar to being like a Todd Gurley clone. So Zach Taylor's coming over from the Rams. He's going to be in a situation similar to what Todd Gurley was in. They're going to be running a lot of 3 receiver sets. He should be more involved in the passing game. And as far as touchdown goes, because touchdowns is the only thing keeping Joe Mixon from being in that elite class, because he's got the yards. I just said he was 3rd in the NFL in yards in 14 games. So he didn't play 16 games. It's not a numbers thing like it is with David Johnson. He's an elite running back. The Bengals didn't put him in a lot of positions to score last year. I think he'll get more opportunities to score this year. And like it is every year, running backs go up and down with touchdowns. It's all based on game flow. But even bad teams, you can score a lot of touchdowns. Just look at Barkley last year. So with Joe Mixon, I feel very comfortable starting him from week to week, knowing he's going to get the yards and hoping that he gets those touchdowns. Next on my list, I have 7, 8, and 9. And filling out those 3 spots is going to be LeVeon Bell, David Johnson, and Todd Gurley. 3 guys who have been elite before, but I don't necessarily expect them to be that same elite going forward, and all for different reasons, to be honest. First of all, Le'Veon Bell is the highest on that because I think of him and David Johnson, he's on the better team. And between him and Todd Gurley, there's no injury risk with Le'Veon Bell, at least not at this moment. And they're not talking about sharing the load with Le'Veon Bell. So Le'Veon Bell should get the entire workload. So when we talk the difference between Le'Veon Bell and Todd Gurley, I just think there's a lower floor with Gurley due to the fact that he could be limited in touches, whereas with Le'Veon Bell, that's not the case. Not only that, there is a more likely, at least in my brain, that Todd Gurley could end up being hurt at some point during this year, whereas with Bell, I just think that it's less likely. And typically, I hate to make that the difference maker between two individuals, but in the situation with Gurley, that just can't be ignored. And as I was saying with Dalvin Cook, if they come in fully healthy and there's no injury concerns at all, then I'm fully willing to draft him, assuming that they're not going to get hurt. Now, if they have a hamstring injury, or in this case, arthritis going in, and I know that that's going to be an issue all year, I don't necessarily want to deal with that, right? Not when I have a person just as talented that I can choose from. So in this case, LeVeon Bell, I have him at 7, and then David Johnson 8, Todd Gurley next. LeVeon Bell, let's talk a little bit about LeVeon Bell. Well, first of all, his coach is going to be Adam Gase, and this is surprisingly, nobody's been talking about this, but this is kind of a red flag. And the reason for that is not because Adam Gase is a bad coach necessarily, but because 2 out of the last 3 years, Miami Dolphins have fallen, so a team coached by Adam Gase, the slowest paced offense, so the least amount of snaps per second, or you understand what I'm saying? So the slowest paced offense, what that means is this just by sheer amount of plays called, it's going to be hard for Le'Veon Bell to keep up with a guy like David Johnson when it comes to how many snaps are on the field. That being said, I do like the offensive line better in New York, and I actually like the offense as a whole better in New York because they added some veterans, some former Pro Bowlers to the interior of their offensive line, so I see a lot of improvement in that regard. When Le'Veon Bell was in Pittsburgh, what a lot of people are talking about is the fact that he is so patient as a runner that he allows his blocks to develop. Well, yeah, that's really easy when you're running behind the Pittsburgh Steelers and there are blocks being developed. What a lot of people have been saying is, well, in New York, who's to say that those blocks are going to get developed? You can sit back there and be patient all you want, but if the blocks aren't coming, you're going to end up getting hit behind the line, which is true. That being said, there's an aspect to Le'Veon Bell's game that helps blocks develop. It's the way he moves. It's the way he waits. It allows for the play to develop. You have to do that as a running back. Even worse, even bad offensive lines eventually, a lot of times, they just need the running back to be just a little bit more patient. That being said, Le'Veon Bell hasn't played for an entire year. I don't know. That's an instinctual thing. Does it go away? I don't know. But I feel like it's got to be like riding a bike. You're at least going to have to figure it out for a little bit. You know, I don't know how long it's... Even if I go without driving for a long period of time, because I'm in the military, so I deploy every once in a while. I get back, my first time behind the wheel, I'm like, okay, let me get this together real quick. Because when you're to do something for a long time, you're not going to be as proficient at it. So I'm a little bit nervous that Le'Veon Bell might start the season off a little rusty. That being said, going back to Adam Gase. So I started going through his history. Adam Gase likes to split carries between running backs. That being said, Le'Veon Bell, we all know, is a different kind of animal. So I had to find, back in the past, is there a situation where Adam Gase actually allowed a running back to be the workhorse? And in 2016, Jay Ajayi got 1,400 yards as a Miami Dolphin. So I think that Le'Veon Bell can at least get that. Those are total yards, so passing and rushing, because he's just a better running back than Jay Ajayi. And I think that the Jets' offensive line can be very good, assuming he can stay healthy throughout that whole time. Now, David Johnson. We saw what his floor was last season. Assuming he stays healthy, that is what his floor was. It was bad. Now, a lot of people are buying into this Cliff Kingsbury. The reason I got David Johnson behind Le'Veon Bell is because, at least with Adam Gase, I know he's coached in the NFL. Kingsbury's coached in college. I don't know that system's going to work in the NFL. I mean, it might. I know they're talking about getting David Johnson more involved, and I do think that he's going to be better than he was last year. If I didn't think that, I wouldn't put him at 8, because he was terrible last year, even though he played 16 games, and you can't bank on a running back to be healthy for 16 games. So with Cliff Kingsbury, I did have to go back through, and it's the same thing. He does for a college coach, he was able to get his running backs heavily involved, and he's been talking about getting David Johnson heavily involved. The reason basically David Johnson's here is because I can see him getting upwards of like 80 receptions this season, even if they can't really figure out a run game. But it should be better because, honestly, Arizona was so terrible last year, couldn't be worse. And then there's Todd Gurley. And as we talked about with Todd Gurley, they're talking about him sharing the workload. I don't know what the hell's going on with Todd Gurley. That's the truth. Nobody does. The truth is, I want to move Todd Gurley. I want to move him to 5. And then some days I'm like, I need to lower him from this spot, because if he truly is missing games or going into every single game questionable, you need to have his backup, especially when there's Monday night, Sunday night games or afternoon games and you just don't have another running back. He's a tough thing to deal with. What I will say is I don't think he gets the same number of carries that he's had in the past. He's not going to get 300 touches this year. I just don't think it's going to happen. And not necessarily because he's going to miss games, just because I think they are going to manage his workload just a bit. I mean, Kamara does the same thing. He splits carries all the time. If he does the same thing as Kamara, I could see it to where he's so efficient in those carries. He's scoring, 14, 15 touchdowns this year on 260 carries. Whereas some of these other guys, they're going to get 300 carries, but they're not going to get nearly as many points from touchdowns or opportunities as Todd Gurley does. So this is where basically I draw the line for him, because when we get to the next guy, James Conner, this is not a guy that has a very prestigious talent background. So was he good last year? Yeah, he was good last year. But what was really the key for James Conner last year was his offensive line. And so when I look back at James Conner, all but really 2 games that he played in, he had 72% of the snaps. The problem with that is that the game that he really split was week 17. So the last time we saw James Conner was after he got hurt. And then we got to see Jalen Samuel and see what he can bring to the table. And then the one game we get to see with James Conner and Samuel after Samuel's breakout was week 17. In week 17, James Conner got 32 touches, he was on the field for 32 snaps, and Jalen Samuel was on the field for 31 snaps. And then I went back and watched that game, and it really felt like they were doing a real balance. Now, does that have more to do with the fact that James Conner was banged up going into that game, or does that have to do with they really believed in Samuel? That being said, Conner outperformed him in that game. And going forward, I have Conner here because I do not buy that they're going to split it like that going forward. I think that James Conner is going to have a very similar role than he did last year. I think Samuel might get a little bit more attention, but for the most part, I expect it to be right. I expect James Conner to be a workhorse. I also expect the Steelers to not be as good because they're not going to have Antonio Brown. Ben Roethlisberger is getting another year older. The offensive line was healthy all last year, and you never know what's going to happen from year to year as far as health goes. So to expect the same numbers as last year with James Conner, I just don't. So I got him right behind Todd Gurley because of the upside that Todd Gurley brings and the upside that LeVeon Bell and David Johnson bring. This is where I got James Conner, and this really breaks up the second tier of my running backs. That's it for today's show. Next episode, we'll be finishing up our running back discussion. If you have any questions, post them in the comment section. I'll be happy to respond to all of them. Be sure to like and subscribe to our videos. I will be posting new content weekly. Till next time, see ya!